Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to cover the second step of the HIA process, which is scoping. Scoping basically asks, what are the important health effects, affected populations, available evidence, etc., that will be covered in this HIA. Basically, what is the scope of the HIA? So the punchline of this particular module is scoping is really the time when the HIA team and stakeholders identify the potential health effects that will be considered and develop a plan for completing the assessment, including specifying their respective roles and responsibilities. This is the aspect of the HIA process where we are, or the component of the HIA process where we are developing research questions, determining the scope, what are the most important impacts, do we have the data, all of these questions. Scoping really gets at sort of the why, the who, and the how. And the primary purpose of scoping is to identify, again, how the HIA will be carried out, also to set those boundaries for the HIA assessment in terms of temporality and also geographically. Scoping also lays the foundation for the assessment, and really, really important for us to have a clear scoping path for the analysis. And also, scoping helps us develop the work plan to guide the analysis. So when we ask why, we're asking ourselves, well, why are we doing the HIA? What are the goals? And those goals will help us as we develop our research questions. When we think about who, we're asking who's going to be involved in conducting the HIA. Who are the members of the HIA team? Do we need consultants? Who are the stakeholders? Who will be impacted by the decision? How do we get to them? How do we involve them in the process? How will this decision impact population health and health disparities? How will we assess the impacts? I really like this figure. This is from a recent publication that shows you all of the different dimensions of the HIA scoping step, highlighting that this is the time to identify stakeholders, to determine data sources and availability, to think about how will the community be engaged in the process, to think about steps that are going to be used later on to prioritize for assessment, and to think about, what are those most critical or important health impacts we want to look at, to help think about roles and responsibilities, again, those boundaries I just mentioned, also to think about the budget and the resources available, and again, what are those potential health impacts that are going to be analyzed. I say screening is a really important step, but once we decide if the HIA is going to be done, this is a really important step as well. When I conduct HIA trainings, I like to say we want to avoid scope creep. That's right, creep. So you might be thinking, what the heck does that mean? I'm talking about when the scope of your analysis just expands more than we thought was going to happen at the beginning of the analysis. So it's so important to go back to your scope of your HIA as you're moving forward. Yes, things pop up. This can be iterative, but we want to make sure that the questions we're answering are consistent within the boundaries of what we've set out as the scope of the HIA. If we look at the minimum elements document that I showed you as part of the first module, here are some highlights about the scoping step. So we're thinking through that plan to conduct the HIA. So you're thinking about the decision, if any alternatives are going to be studied, what are those potential significant health and health equity impacts, what are those boundaries, what are those particular demographic categories we care about, what are those research questions for impact analysis, what do we know in terms of the evidence that we have available and what kinds of methods we're going to have to use, what's going to be our approach to characterizing the impacts and their distribution. We also think about how will we involve any experts or key informants. Most HIAs have some sort of advisory group, so this would be the time to think through who might be part of that team. We also develop a plan for external and public review. We'll come back to reporting step later, but this is the time to think through a bit, how might we go about do that? When do we want to do that? Are there any opportune times where we want to make sure our report is shared? This is also a time to develop that initial plan for dissemination of findings and recommendations, and also a stakeholder engagement plan. I'll talk again about stakeholder engagement a little bit later, but this is the time also to begin to think through even further how the stakeholders are going to be engaged in the process. That being said, I also want to say that ideally stakeholders should be part of scoping anyway. They should be part of this process. During scoping, we're also trying to identify the range of health issues to be examined and also thinking about those potential pathways that should be considered, linking that proposed decision to health determinants and health outcomes. To avoid scope creep, I think it's really important that the final scope of the HIA should focus on those impacts with the greatest potential significance. Now, how you define significance is really up to you, but I like to think about significance in terms of magnitude, severity, certainty, stakeholder priorities, equity. So when we balance all of those things together, asking ourselves, what are those factors that are going to really be important in this analysis? Part of the scoping process should really involve expertise of health professionals, particularly for individuals conducting the HIA who are not educated in public health and who haven't been trained, in public health. And so they might want to engage health professionals as well as the potentially affected communities and other decision makers to help inform its scope. And finally, in the scoping process, we think through those potential inequities and how are we going to think through and are there ways that the health impact assessment might affect groups disproportionately based on age, gender, income, place, etc. Part of the scoping process involves creating what we consider pathway diagrams. And this is just an example from a real HIA. And this is of a Portland transit study. So when we develop pathway diagrams, I tend to work from left to right. I've seen other ways, but this way seems to really work for me, and it's logical and helps, and is also a good way to help explain what we're talking about to decision makers and stakeholders. So for this particular HIA, they were looking at a choice of transit alternatives, and it was looking at not building anything compared to enhancing their bus line or building a new streetcar. And so the way that this diagram is set up, those decisions are in a box under the decision column. The next column is headed direct impacts, and ultimately is highlighting these two main direct impacts from the choices that are in the decision column. And one is that we would have new infrastructure, and the second is that there would be improved transit or level of service. And what we do is, based on our existing knowledge, through the engagement that we just talked about as part of scoping, we start to draw out, well, how could those direct impacts affect health determinants? So if we look at this next column, for this HIA, they thought about disposable income, noise, safety from crashes, concentration of outdoor air pollutants, opportunities for physical activity, and access to health supportive resources. If this was a HIA training, we would go through how we sort of come up with these health determinants, and we would draw the arrows. But I'm just sort of fast forwarding through what would it look like when we finish the process. So ultimately, what we have here is that we're seeing, for example, the new infrastructure box leads to noise. Well, we might say, well, building new infrastructure could change noise levels. At this point, we're not trying to predict which direction. We're just saying there will be a change in noise. Or new infrastructure also has a line going to concentration of outdoor air pollutants. Again, we think new infrastructure could change the concentration of outdoor air pollutants. We're not saying if it's going to go up or if it's going to be reduced, just that there will be a change. There's also a line going to safety from crashes. So new infrastructure could change safety measures and so forth. And so this is what we do for an HIA, and then ultimately you're drawing lines. We have solid lines here, there are dotted lines, and depending on which HIA you're looking at, some practitioners use those lines to show different types of relationships. If you decide to do that, as long as you have some key to tell the reader what those lines mean, you can decide to do it any way that makes sense to you. So after we identify those health determinants, we have another column for health outcomes, and we do the same thing. So the questions are, for the things we're going to focus on, what are those health outcomes? So for this one, there are highlights from concentration of outdoor air pollutants, for example. So the health outcomes that we would care about relate to things like lung cancer and asthma, all-cause mortality. The box for safety from crashes leads to injuries and death, and so we'd care about changes in those metrics. For opportunities for physical activity, We're thinking about connections to non-communicable diseases like diabetes and stroke, but also things like high blood pressure, mental health outcomes. And for the box for access to health supported services, the way that this has been diagrammed out or sort of conceptualized, there are multiple beneficial mental and physical outcomes. And for ease or of looking at this figure, there could be many more things in this box, but that's sort of the aggregate category. So again, this is just one example of a pathway diagram. There are so many out there. If you are interested in looking at more examples, I encourage you to go to the website for the Health Impact Project. That map I showed you as part of Module 1, you can find on their website where you can search for HIAs and see completed HIAs and see the reports, and you'll be able to get a better sense of how people are coming up with these pathway diagrams. But this is really important as part of the scope. We will ultimately develop research questions for each of these arrows and then try to define quantitatively and/or qualitatively how these boxes are connected. For this particular HIA, they decided that the final scope was going to be to focus on these 4 boxes here in that sort of yellowish color, so the 4 boxes at the bottom of the health determinants category. So again, after doing all this analysis, that's where they focused for a number of reasons based on the evidence, on input from stakeholders, and that was the focus of their analysis. I wanted to just end by showing you another tool. So in addition to creating a pathway diagram, this is a scoping worksheet. This is from Human Impact Partners. Again, if you're interested in some tools, and I have this on the resources for the course, you can go to the Human Impact Partners website and find things like a scoping worksheet. What I like about this is that it helps you think through for a particular determinant. What's the geographic scope? What are the research questions? What are the indicators? What are the data sources? What are the methods? How high of a priority is it for us to sort of think through this and any other relevant notes? This worksheet, thinking through these various factors, will help us for the next step of the HIA process, which is the assessment step. So before we wrap up, let me just say again, I wanted to provide an overview of HIA scoping. There are a lot of tools and resources out there to help you with this step of the HIA process. I encourage you not to rush through this process. This is a time to really spend thinking through what's the scope of the analysis, what are the pathways, and creating pathways is really an art, and it's iterative, and you might see that it takes you a long time and your pathways change, and that's okay, because ultimately we want to develop research questions that are going to help guide the analysis, which will be part of the next step of the HIA process assessment, which we will turn to in a moment. So thank you.